Hi there, welcome back to COG 266, Brains, Minds, and Consciousness. So, we've talked quite a bit about how neurons send information, and today we're going to talk about how certain neurons receive information that may be a little bit different than what we've talked about so far. So, the basics, I can't stress enough. Communication is key to what drives our complex brains, our minds, our consciousness, our interactions with the world, everything about what a brain does, right? So the ability to move information around, or put another way, for one event to trigger another event somewhere else. That's what enables the cells of the brain to interact as a whole instead of as individual little biological blobs that don't, before chemotaxis, that just kind of scooted around and tried to survive on their own. Without communication of some kind, very little can actually happen. So, what kinds of communication have we covered? First, we covered communication within neurons. So those chemical and physical components of neurons, so the ions and the protein channels, they move around to send a signal across the cell, right? There's the membrane potentials, which govern how the ions move in and out of the cell, altering the overall charge. The action potential is the sort of pattern of change in the membrane and the cell itself that moves something, causes a bit of information to move down the cell. And there's some rules that go along with it, like the refractory periods. The cell can only fire so often, and threshold of activation, so it has to be a certain amount of charge for it to trigger. So this is how information moves across one cell. How about communication between neurons? So we've seen this with the neurotransmitters, right? So they will jump across the synaptic cleft from one neuron to another one, and sometimes many other ones. That's a key thing to keep in mind. So neurotransmitters will work quickly to send immediate signals and send more and more as the firing rate increases, whereas neuromodulators might work slowly to alter the properties of the postsynaptic cells. But altogether, this represents an increase in complexity because there's both excitatory and inhibitory connections between cells, and that allows for a certain amount of transformation of information. And also, the complexity gets even further compounded because we can temporarily change the properties of nearby cells, meaning there's a lot you can do with neurons connected to each other. So this is how information moves between cells and can be transformed in the process. So what do we mean by transforming information? Consider a traffic light. The information available in a traffic light, there's quite a lot, but there are two chunks that are useful to us. When the light is red, in America at least, that's at the top, and the wavelength of the light coming out of that light is about 650 nanometers. That's how we get red out of photons. That's the wavelength of those photons. Yellow light is in the middle position and about 580 nanometers for the wavelength, while green light is in the lowest position and about 550 nanometers. So, taken all together, we have three different kinds of information on the traffic light, right? We have the highest thing, which has the longest wavelengths, the middle thing that has different wavelengths, and the lowest thing that has yet even shorter wavelengths. We don't just stop there, right? That is the information as it exists in the world, but we know what these things mean. We know that this information is useful for specific things, right? So when we transform that information, we transform a red signal into danger, stop. We transform a yellow signal into caution, slow down, or if you're a leadfoot, you might speed up to try to beat the light. Both are kind of valid. I'm not going to argue with you about it. And then green light is safe, go. So what this represents in very broad strokes, is the very, very simple basic information available in the world as basic quantities, so like the nanometer amount for the wavelength, and relations, so relative position of elements in the world, translates to more complex, complete concepts. These are things that we use for very important decisions in our brain, somewhere in the mix. So, transforming information is a pretty key element here. So a single neural signal might be simple, on and off, right? It's either firing or it's not. But it also has the firing rate, so it can kind of transmit some quantity. It has its connections that can be positive and negative, so we can invert a signal, which is key to transforming any signal. Ask a computer scientist taking computer organization classes, they can key you into that. And also there's the element of the fact that the cells can receive and combine signals from a lot of sources. They can sum up signals. They can incorporate lots of data into one point, right? And they can send to many sources. So altogether what this means is that there's more complex patterns can be captured, such that something like a single red light existing in the world, through all the complex interactions in our brain, can become this idea of cease walking activity, engage, slow down, and wait, right? Or driving, right, in the same way. Take your foot off the accelerator, put it on the brake, and now just wait until the light changes. That's a lot. That's a very complex idea, and the only way we could get there is by transforming the information from the world into a more complex, complete, useful thought. Okay, but what? How does light become thought? How do we scale this up? So we've started to see how firing rates become complex patterns in at least, I hope, in broad strokes, right? You can see how one neuron firing such and such with a different neuron firing such and such, both feeding into a new neuron firing a certain amount, you might have the ability to represent some pretty complex things if you have enough of them together. But we've been kind of circular in the way we've talked about their components so far. Neurons can receive signals from other neurons, cool, and then they send them on to also other neurons. How does light enter the picture here? We have neurons talking to neurons. When can an outside signal come in? What are the mechanisms for that? So how the heck does light even get inside of our system? And that brings us to communication beyond neurons. So our wonderful neural populations in our brains, this complex network, has to have some way to interact with the world, not just with each other, right? So we've talked about the neurotransmitters and how those let neurons talk to each other. We must have a way to interact outside of that. So we need to receive information from the world, maybe do some processing on it, transform it, store it maybe, and then do something in the world. What we're touching on right now is some of the fundamental components of a mind: perceiving, cognizing, and acting. So perception, cognition, and action. These are big. In fact, I should blow these up and put them writ large on a single slide together, because these are fundamentally critical parts of how minds do things. We're not yet, this is not yet the mind section. We're still firmly rooted in brain. We got a lot to talk about. But this is how we start to overlap. We see, okay, we're getting from neurons being big, complex populations of stuff. How do we get stuff in? What do we do with it? And how do we get stuff out of the system? So let's enter into perception. This is a function of the mind that obtains and uses information about the outside world to behave appropriately and successfully in the world. How does that sort of information get in here? So the idea that allows for this, the structures that allow for this, are sensory receptors. So sensation, right? All neurons already have receptors. We've already talked about some, the channels that receive neurotransmitters those are receptors. A neurotransmitter hits them and they say, ooh, I'll open up, thanks. So sensory receptors are just another kind, except instead of reacting to things from other neurons, they respond somehow to stimuli from the outside world. This is, this is very similar, but also wildly unique, and we'll talk about some of that. So, first, let's kind of cover what would be interesting enough in the outside world that we would spend, energy evolutionary points, on our skill tree to build receptors for. What's out there that we need to know about to do well in the world? And something, the way to think about this is that just think about the world is full of energy, moving around, changing, affecting particles, cells, organisms, fields, quantum mechanics, that kind of stuff. All kinds of stuff happening out there in the world. Some of these things are super good for us. We like food. We like mates. We like places to safely sleep. We like air. We like water. We like all the things that help our bodies survive. There's lots of stuff that we like, right? There's also some stuff out there that we really don't like. And that's things like tigers and earthquakes and falling rocks and poison and things that make us dead. We don't want to make us dead. That's pretty bad for successfully surviving as an organism. So that's the kind of stuff, just like the tiny little cells floating around in the goo long, long ago, they might want to go away from bad things and go toward good things. As below, so above. This is us as well. The more things change, the more things stay the same. So, okay, if that's the case, and we want to go toward good things and move away from bad things, then what is it that's bouncing around out there that we can detect? These are the ones that are familiar to us. Light. So, cool thing for us, it's nice that objects often differentiate themselves pretty well by things that are associated with light, like the color, the luminosity, the reflectance. We love shiny things, apparently. So, light, the phenomenon in the world, the light that comes from the sun and bounces off of stuff, it's just out there, just doing its thing. It might be pretty cool if we could detect light, right? How about sound? Different objects and events have different vibration patterns. A large truck driving towards you sounds quite different from a scooter or a bicycle with a bell. Those are different kinds of sounds that we might want to avoid, or, well, we want to avoid all three of these, but some of them we really need to avoid, whereas others we would prefer to avoid. Chemicals. So poisonous and noxious things are going to emit different chemicals, just chemicals, than healthy and nutritious things. Probably. Usually, at least. That's pretty important. We don't want to eat. We want to avoid as much poison as we can. We want to avoid rotted things. We want to avoid things that might make us sick, that might disrupt our internal system, especially with something as vulnerable as what we're going to eat and consume and put into our bodies. Some other stuff, like textures and weight and pressure, if we are physically in contact with something as a big, as a blob, as an organism of sorts, we might want to get a little bit more data on what that thing is that we are touching. Is this, for example, my dad, a bear, or a boulder? That's pretty important for us to be able to distinguish. Is something pressing on me very hard or something pressing on me very lightly? That's useful to know. How threatened am I of being punctured, for example? So, this begins our journey into how we sense different kinds of energy in the world. Let's go. So, sensing mechanical energy. A little bit of physics here. It just so happens that it matters. So, mechanoreceptors are the kind of neuron or neural tissue that can respond to physical distortions in themselves. So, for example, the somatosensory system, that's our touch sense. detecting pressure with most of the parts of our body. We can detect pressure on the outside. Good to know. Is something trying to pierce me? That's not great. I don't want to be pierced. Is something laying on me and maybe kind of affecting my circulation? I might want to remove it. These things are good to know. Auditory system, sound in the air. Hey, we live in air, sound moves through it. This is pretty good for us to be able to have sensors that don't just detect the kinds of pressure from that wave, but they actually can help us differentiate the qualities of the vibrations in that wave. So, let's talk about each of these. Somatosensory mechanoreceptors. So there are both small and large receptors. Small receptors for finer details, where large receptors for sort of broader whole surface area type reception. So some of these are slow adapting, so they're going to stay active as long as there is a stimulus touching. And some of them are rapidly adapting, which are more about onset and offset. So detecting, something has changed, and something has changed again, versus the ones that kind of tell us how much is pressure happening. Let's look at just one kind of mechanoreceptor to try and get a read on how these things work. So these are Pacinian corpuscles. These are large mechanoreceptors, so they're well understood because they can you can remove them and they still work. So you can just snip one out and use it, and it will do its thing, which is super weird. But here's the idea. They have bulbous endings covered in lots of layers of, myelin. It's not used for the same thing here. It's more of just sort of a padding to increase surface area. And the way this works is that the action potentials will be created based on the pressure coming in. So studying the way these have been studied, you remove them and use them in isolation. A fine point can be pressed onto the ending. The response is proportional to the pressure. So sufficient pressure on this particular end, the bulb here, will cause an action potential. More pressure, more strength. The action potentials will keep firing, rather. It will fire and fire and fire because there is more distortion. But why? Well, it has a lot to do with what we've already talked about. When the cell membrane is displaced because of stretching, because physical pressure has stretched it, ion channels open up. Guess what that means? That means that these ion channels will let ions in, and whoa, hey, that we know. We know how to take that to an action potential, and then to a different neuron, and then hey, the signal of how much pressure is being put on me is in my brain system. We have received mechanical pressure from the outside world and turned it into a neural signal. This is important, and this, if you take nothing else away from this lecture, that is the key element. We can talk about a few other kinds here, so they all work on some variation of this. So here's a slice of skin. I'd zoom it in a little bit more, but I'm out of real estate on the screen because of the things that will pop up. So there's lots of stuff here. There's lots of kinds of mechanoreceptors here. So let's look at a few. There are free nerve endings near the surface, so just below the skin's outside layer, but above like the fatty layer. I guess in the subcutaneous stuff. Sometimes I don't always know all the anatomy of the skin and such. I'm not a skin doctor. So there are free nerve endings. These ones are related to pain. These are the ones that will send pain signals up to your brain. They're a little different. So this is about, hey, has this area of my skin been damaged in some way? Well, if so, I'm gonna fire like crazy. Has to do with the physical properties of the skin around. The free nerve endings, they'll be cut, and thus, time to fire. Fire. Not a great feeling, but that's important for us to know, right? Pain is this phenomenon that says, hey, something is terribly wrong, I need help. We have Ruffini endings, so these are more complex. They have to do with stretching sensations. I won't dive into exactly how all of these work. We're just sort of glossing over some of them just to recognize what is available. So we have pain, we have stretching. Meissner corpuscles, these help with texture. So these kinds of corpuscles are similar to the Pacinian ones we just talked about, but they respond to more subtle variations, and so they can help us with things like what's the texture of the wood of this desk versus the sort of laminate of this shelf. You can't see what I'm touching, but that I hope it makes sense. Wood versus laminate, very subtle differences in very small scale changes in pressure. Also slow vibrations. So things that are lower level vibrations, not it just happens to be the way that these things are constructed, they're able to detect both. Merkel discs can help detect sustained pressure. So these are the kind that will stay on longer. They're not about the sharp changes, but the longer durations. And then our Pacinian corpuscles, which have to do a lot with deep pressure and fast vibrations. So the difference between slow and fast here being that their fast vibrations are perhaps more important to capture in terms of deep trauma versus slower vibrations, which might be just ambient atmospheric vibrations. So that is a sweep of the kinds of mechanoreceptors associated with touch. We won't stay on this. We're just recognize that there is a variety and that they have quite a lot going on. But they all function in a similar way to these friendly little corpuscles. The Pacinian ones. Right. And forward, just again, the membrane literally deforming causes the influx of ions. One thing to note is that touch receptors, there's different densities across your body. So there are a lot more neurons dedicated to processing things that are happening in the face, lips, tongue, and hands. I think you could probably guess why. These are the things that we use all the time. Face, lots of stuff going on up in the face and right in front of a pretty important part of our body, the brain. Tongue and lips, lots of food, lots of various things, lots of talking stuff. We have an outsized amount of our brain associated with the lips and tongue, and the hands, because that's where we do stuff. That's how we type everything. That's how we write things. That's how we juggle. That's how we, capoeira dancers balance themselves. So less going on in the legs and the torso. There's sort of more broader receptors in those areas because we don't need as much fine detailed information. I don't need 1 neuron per every 1 millimeter of skin, or that's way too big, but just n neurons per millimeter of skin in the face. I don't need that many. I need maybe 1/100th of that to detect things on my chest, right? And this would have to do with how well can you spatially locate those things that are happening. If somebody touches a very specific part of your lip, you'd probably get a pretty good accuracy rating on that. You'd be able to tell within the, 1/8 of an inch where someone poked your lip. Versus if somebody poked the middle of your back, you might be off by a whole inch or so if you had to guess. That's the idea. Also, this slide, you can meet our friend the sensory homunculus. It is a sort of a graphic representation of how much of our brain is dedicated to each of these processes, each of these sensations. So in a certain area of your brain, the motor strip that we'll cover in a later date, but you have a lot of real estate for face, hands, lips, fingers, not very much for hip and like chest and all that, right? This guy is kind of a goofy looking critter, but that's actually a pretty good representation. And before we scoot on, we should talk about nociceptors, these are the ones that are associated with they're sort of specialized towards temperature and pain. They're a little bit more complex and a little less understood, probably because it's weird that the experience is relative. So if I go from very cold to inserted in lukewarm water, or very hot and inserted in lukewarm water, the temperature receptors will behave wildly differently. So something that is still active in research. So that's the host of sort of the somatosensory stuff, the things that are in your bodily system that you might need to detect mechanical energy out there in the world. Auditory mechanoreceptors are another variation here. Auditory mechanoreceptors they're similar to touch, right? They're similar to what we just saw, and they are in the auditory system. So past the eardrum is the cochlea, the fluid-filled, multi-layered, spiral-shaped organ fella, looking like that at the bottom. You don't need to think of it as a spiral, though. Think of it more like this big flat sheet that we're looking at here. And this sheet has different thicknesses on it. So sound comes into your ear, hits the drum, right? And that will transmit to the fluid inside the cochlea. And then that will move to this membrane. So the basilar membrane is this big, it's curled up inside your ear, but think of it as this flat, long, stretching membrane. It's tough, it's flexible, it's rolled up, and it has different thicknesses, meaning you can think of it like a piano. This thickness on the far left, means that it's only going to vibrate at low frequencies of sound, the oohs of the world, right? Whereas thinner parts of this membrane will vibrate at higher frequencies in the world. Ah, ooh, ah, right? Two different notes, and they're going to vibrate different parts of this big flat friend. So, how do we get from this big flat vibrato boy to sound? Well, there are hair cells sitting all over the basilar membrane. They look like this. And they are not floating, but they are sitting in in the fluid in the ear. The trick here is that fluid in the ear is rich in potassium ions, positive ions. They can directly activate the synapses of these neurons, these neural hair fibers, to cause action potentials. How's that? Well, when the basilar membrane vibrates, different neurons will different pieces of these hair particles will wobble. They will wobble in the fluid. They will move left and right, back and forth, wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. The other ones nearby won't be doing that. They're not going to vibrate because they're not on a part of the basilar membrane that is going to shake. So the shaking one drags these hairs through the rich fluid here, and they will accumulate action potentials because they will be colliding, they will be absorbing more of this positive, the ions, the potassium ions. Sorry, I get mixed up sometimes. I look at the first letter and I think, whoa, what's the word? What's the word? Potassium does not start with a K. Shameful. So, this, I hope, you're starting to see how now we have this big long membrane with hairs all over it. Different parts are going to vibrate with different sound frequencies. That's how we have an array of these hair fibers wobbling in the fluid freely based on what sounds are coming through the drum. So high frequencies will hit the thinner part more actively, low frequencies will hit the thicker part more actively, And the different hair cells across this whole width are going to give the different experiences of different pitches. This is pretty cool. It's the piano model of how we receive these different signals. So how does that translate to audio in the brain? Well, the differences in frequency, they are preserved. So if you look in the audio cortex, the auditory cortex, in the the higher level brain regions, you actually can still recognize, oh, this area is lighting up with this frequency and this area is lighting up with this frequency. So we kind of pull in as close a copy as we can of the frequency pattern that exists in our ears. For us, it's relatively straightforward. We just kind of try to decode these different key presses on the piano of our inner ear. But there are animals that require a lot more of their auditory systems and have really complex auditory cortexes. For instance, bats, who must deal with echolocation stuff, they've got all kinds of systems that light up for different things like delay, different locations, 3D space stuff. It's wild. Bats have a lot more stuff, or a lot more processing going on, whereas we have mostly just different frequencies and a little bit of other stuff helping to locate things in space. So that sums up. So this is the two kinds of mechanoreceptors that we use all the time to detect information in the world. So we think of these as directly gated receptors. So mechanoreceptors are directly gated. And the reason for that is their activity is governed by the outside action, just kind of directly deforming their cell membranes, opening the gates, right? This just changes the ion flow directly and sends signals on that, so that the rest of our neurons can do what they do, right? Okay, so I'm going to cut this off here and make this a little bit shorter of a lecture, because there's another large chunk of an overview of these kinds of systems for our next time. But before we go, I want to, one of the nice benefits of dealing in studying the human system is that you are available to do an experiment on yourself. Don't worry, it's not collecting data. This is just toy experiments for you to think about what we've just talked about. So, quick experiment 1. Set a finger on the tip of your nose and then close your eyes, just so you can maybe shut out some of the other stimuli in the world. And just think about the sensations you're having. Now, apply light pressure to your nose and hold it there. Note, when you applied the pressure, there was a sudden change that was very detectable to you. But then after that fades, there's that lingering sense of some amount of pressure on your nose. The initial change was caused by the rapidly adapting mechanoreceptors sending their signal, and then, oh, hey, we're done, the change has happened, I'm going to go back to being dormant, while the sustained sense of pressure is from a mechanoreceptor that is continuing to fire because the pressure is there. Now, increase the pressure slightly. Now hold it again. Another sudden change, and a sense of more pressure lingers, right? Now release all the pressure. Again, there is a sense of sudden change, and then a sense of no pressure left. This is extremely simple, but it's designed to show you it's tough to think about the kind of information your brain is using and receiving, but you can sort of tell, you can suss out that there is a difference between the onset changes that you can detect and the sustained signals that you can detect. Okay. Quick experiment 2. Now, this one involves sound. It involves a sound test. In many experience, it can feel quite loud. I've turned it down very much, but just warning you, you may want to turn it down a little more. But we're gonna do this. You are warned. But try to stick it out. It's not, it's not pleasant when it gets into higher echelons here, but it's not drastic either. So quiet yourself, close your eyes. Well, no, you can keep your eyes open because it's nice to watch the little animation here, but just listen carefully and think about the differences between the low end and the high end experiences you're having. Right at the end was awful, but that was your cochlea, your rolled up basilar membrane, the different areas of it vibrating at different frequencies. It was sliding gently along, disturbing different hairs along that cochlear membrane until we got past the range at which it would vibrate. That is your full experience of sound. Now, these are pure tones, which your ear is much more capable than that. It can detect very complex patterns like voices. My voice has tons of these different tones all bound up in it. So, that brings us to the end of sensing mechanical energy. So remember, these are directly gated receptors. They respond to deformations in the cell membrane. These are the mechanoreceptors in touch and hearing, our somatosensory system and our auditory system. Next time, we'll talk about second messengers, which aren't directly gated. They involve a different process, including taste and smell, but also vision. So, see you then. But as always, a final thought. Consider our ability to detect mechanical distortions in the world around us as made possible by our mechanoreceptors and the wide variety of information they make available to us, from the simple, the amount of pressure, for example, to the more complex, like textures. What sort of actions might become impossible without being able to incorporate this information? Anything that might still be feasible? All right, thanks. That's it. Take care.